Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to
Hello and welcome to Movies vs. Capitalism, an anti-capitalist movie podcast. I'm Rivka.
And I'm Frank. And welcome back, Riv. You took a little break last week. You were traveling. I hope your trip was wonderful. I mean, we've already spoken about your trip, but I guess I'm setting it up for you to talk about it for the audience.
Yes, I was in London town.
London town.
It was so fun. It was a really good trip. It was a really good time. As expected, the theater was a lot cheaper because they get a lot more support from their government for the arts.
Oh, is that true? I didn't know that about the UK. Is that?
Yeah, they just get a lot more, funding for the arts. So
amazing.
Great.
Uh-huh.
I think the best place, Germany gets it the most. Germany is particularly for theater.
Oh.
You can make a living as a theater artist. Pretty cool.
That was very cool.
One highlight was we of course were we want to go see where our boy Karl Marx was buried. So we did go to Highgate Cemetery.
That's right.
And pay our regards. And there's one place where it's sort of the memorial, amazing stone sculpture of Karl, and then the actual grave, which is much more modest, just a grave among graves. A very cool cemetery. And people just left all of this. It was just all of these different notes and money all over the grave, representing where commies and socialists from all over. It was very cool. But there was a bracelet that said, he is my daddy, or something like that. It's I loved it. It was so good.
I like the idea of people just leaving money on the grave. Here's your exchange value, Karl.
Yeah, I was a little oop, but I guess that's what people, I didn't leave any. I was I don't have anything that I feel would be appropriate. So,
or maybe it's mutual aid. Maybe it's people being people might come here that might need this.
And then we did a walking tour of London called Marx Walks, which was very cool. That took us to where Marx lived, where Engels lived, where the Communist Manifesto was decided upon, became not written, but there was a big important meeting. And I sent you a photo of it because after I was, watching Love is Blind UK. And I was oh, that's so fun. They were on their bachelorette party, and in the background, I'm oh, in this shot, we have Love is Blind UK going to their bachelorette party and also the historic building where the Communist Manifesto was written. Talk about
contradictions.
But that was really cool, and it ended in the library by the British Museum where Marx wrote Capital, and the tour guide was really cool. So I'm gonna try and get him on.
Oh, hell yeah.
On the pod.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah. But if you're in London, Marx Walks. It was fun.
Dope. Well, we can link to that in the show notes. So we wanted to keep this fairly brief up top because we got a jam-packed conversation coming up after this. I did, though, say last week that Riv and I would touch on the Democratic National Convention, aka the DNC, which wrapped 2 weeks ago at this point. But we'll keep this brief because I think everything that's been said about the DNC has been said and then said again, and then, rebuttals and then backlashes and rebuttals to the backlashes. So
yeah. And unlike the debate, I couldn't really bring myself to fully watch. So I caught glimpses of Pink performing on which, don't get me wrong, I fucking love Pink.
Sure.
It's really random. I go hard for it. But yeah, I didn't know you said we would discuss it, so I did not watch it, listeners, just to keep a little sane.
I think that's totally fair. I think big takeaway, even if you just watched the highlights, were the vibes were immaculate. The vibes were off the walls. And I've heard from people who were actually there at the DNC that just the energy at the convention center was just off the charts. The positive energy, so great. And
it's what I will say it's what we kind of talked about. It's what we wanted when we were saying Biden needs to, this would not have happened under Biden.
Yes, 100%.
The vibes would, I'm trying to even picture it. The vibes were not there.
Negative vibes with Biden. And substantively, materially, I didn't really hear or see anything from the Democrats that led me to believe that the Harris administration would really be any different than the Biden administration. I think the big sticking point for a lot of people, especially those who have been vocal about the genocide in Gaza, is that the DNC did not allow a single Palestinian or Palestinian American speaker during the 4 days of speeches. Yeah. 4 days of speeches.
Deeply disappointing and deeply
telling
and strategically what?
Yeah, really wild, especially considering that the uncommitted movement literally had delegates at the DNC.
Yeah.
You know, like the uncommitted movement, which has been organized by grassroots organizers in a few swing states or really across the country, but have made a lot of progress in swing states saying basically, we're uncommitted to a candidate until we get, you know, some actual policy change on Israel's genocide in Gaza, whether that's an arms embargo, whether that's a cutoff of funding, a cut of diplomatic ties. So they actually had delegates at the convention, meaning that their voices should have been represented. Even if they didn't have delegates, the voices of Palestinian Americans should have been featured on stage, considering they had a family member of Israeli hostages speak. At the very least, to give the appearance of balance or even just basic lip service to, you know, Arab and Muslim Americans who were feeling very, you know, not great about this election. They also made time for like a border patrol officer to speak, for like cops to speak, for fucking Republicans to speak. So many Republicans got up there and got the chance to speak. And the DNC was like, no, we will not let one single Palestinian person on this stage, even for 2 minutes. So as much as the vibes were great, I was pretty disappointed by whatever policy stuff came out of the DNC. And I've had a few conversations with people. I'm trying not to yuck people's yum when it comes to Harris and the positive vibes, because like you said, like Biden was going to sleepwalk us into a second Trump term. So I'm thrilled that the Democrats have a fighting chance to actually stave off a second Trump term. But I'm trying to walk that line of remaining critical of Harris's candidacy and her campaign and what her administration might look like, while still, I don't know, being like the slightest modicum of glad that it's not Biden. I mean, how are you even dealing with that?
Yeah, I don't want to. I guess it's just the idea of yucking someone's yum. I'm like, you can like that, but don't try and make me.
Sure.
It's hard because I remember like the Bernie campaign, and I understand what it's like to put all your sort of faith and eggs and like be so excited about a human being and those lines to blur. Right. And like the movement and what it means and like have those high hopes. But I think just where I've come even since those movements of just like a bigger structural understanding and trying to see the organizing process as like many little wins and many little movements happening at once. And also that we have to move towards something bigger. I'm trying to like use that as much hope as I can grasp to keep myself from being like furious and bitter. Does that make sense?
Sure. That totally makes sense. Like not giving a lot of thought space to this even, because it's like, well, we knew that this is what it was going to be. So like, let's our fight is somewhere else.
Yeah. Like I really lost my mind, I feel like in 2016.
Why? What happened?
Yeah, I don't know. Something happened. But like leading up to that, I just remember the feeling of like, this is the person. And like, that feels like it got me very myopic, if I'm using that word right.
Yeah.
Right? Myopic, like, you know, so I'm trying to like I'm trying to keep the vision open. Yeah.
And the last thing I'll say quickly about the DNC is that if anyone's thinking that we're, you know, too hung up on the Israel-Gaza question and how that was addressed. Also, someone, I forget, I read it on Twitter, but someone online did the count, and like the word border and border control were used like dozens of times throughout the DNC, and the terms climate and healthcare were only used like a few times. So like this is just like across the board, Democrats sort of abandoning some of the main issues that their voters have been begging for years and just barreling through on vibes. So
I think that was the thing. I think that's why I was like kind of like I can't even watch the performance of the DNC just because I know what it is at this period of time to be baited on the left, right? Mm-hmm. But knowing substantially their game plan is to push more towards the right. Like substantially when it comes to any kind of like you were saying, the things that are actually being talked about. So it's like we'll give you left vibes with like a right-wing policy and hope you don't notice because you're too fucking scared of Trump.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And that's kind of what,
Yeah, cracking down on the border. Kamala saying we're going to have the most lethal military on planet Earth. It's like, yo, we just want healthcare. Like, what is happening?
Yeah. We just want fucking healthcare.
All right, I think we should keep it brief and just end it there, because I'm sure most of our audience have heard or read these takes already. And we've got a blockbuster conversation coming up with Harvey Kaye. But before we do, we just want to remind our audience that we do not sell ads on this show. We rely completely on community support to keep it going, and you can do that by subscribing to our Patreon.
That's right. For just $5 a month, you get access to new bonus episodes and our entire back catalog. Our Patreon link is in the episode description in your podcast player, or you can find it at mvcpod.com. Also, if you make sure to rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast on your podcast player, that would be awesome. You won't miss any new episodes, and it really helps us in that whole algorithm thing.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with myself and Harvey Kaye for a very special episode we're calling Ask a Marxist Part 1. Hey everyone, we've got an amazing organization we want to tell you about called Anti-Capitalism for Artists.
Anti-Capitalism for Artists is an education-based community dedicated to raising the class consciousness of artists.
Their core offering, the 10-week Intro to Anti-Capitalism course, is designed to be accessible to anyone looking to get familiar with a wide range of anti-capitalist concepts and ideas.
They do this by offering an eclectic array of free virtual and in-person events year-round, geared to meet all manner of knowledge backgrounds. Frank and I both took the course in different cohorts, and it really was amazing. You get to meet with a group of people who are interested in anti-capitalism, you build solidarity, and it's also a lot of fun.
Yeah, they put together such an amazing, comprehensive reading list from anti-capitalist writers from all different types of tendencies, from Marx to black radicalism to intersectional feminism to queer liberation to modern-day anti-capitalists. So you really get a firm grounding in a diverse and wide array of concepts.
Artists of all kinds, abilities, and professional statuses are welcome to join A4A's community, where they can learn, build community, and co-create their own events and offerings.
You can learn more, reach out, or support their work by donating at anticapitalismforartists.com, or find them on Instagram at anticapitalismforartists.
Love you, comrades. Now back to the show.
All right, we are joined once again by one of our favorite returning guests, Mr. Harvey Kaye. You know him, you love him. Harvey, I actually don't have your bio pulled up. Usually we give the little biography, but I think I could do it probably from memory. Professor Emeritus for Democracy and Justice Studies at University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. Author of several books, including Thomas Paine. Where am I? You can help me out. 18 books. 18 books.
Including the British Marxist historian.
Thomas
Paine and the Promise of America.
And the Promise of America.
Right. The Fight for the Four Freedoms.
Fight for the Four Freedoms. Yep.
And Take Hold of Our History, Make America Radical Again. And I'm leaving out a whole bunch which might be of interest to people. So if they send me a note, I'm happy to send them my Vita.
Harvey has his CV ready in case you want to get the hard copy.
In case you want to hire me for something.
Sure. But Harvey, I'm so thrilled for you to be here today. Thank you again for your time as always. This has been an episode, a non-movie episode. We might talk about movies a little bit here and there, but this is.
I hope so. Sure.
This will decidedly be a non-movie coverage episode. But I wanted to do this because you're really a font of wisdom, and I've learned so much from you. And I just wanted to take the opportunity to just sort of like pick your brain in a little more of a looser format. So
great.
We're calling this episode Ask a Marxist, although I know you don't strictly adhere to that labeling these days.
Well, if I could check, and I'll respond to what you just said. Mm-hmm. Look, I did my PhD back in the 70s, so it's really, it's almost 50 years since then. I would definitely have identified as a Marxist through the 70s, 70s, 80s, and sort of into the 90s. But it served no purpose. And it served no purpose.
Why?
I'm a socialist. Well, I'm glad you asked. Mm-hmm. Partially because it immediately kicks off a whole set of thoughts in people's heads, and they may not listen to what I say because they immediately conjure up images and all of that. Think about how difficult it was for even anyone to talk about Marx, et cetera, and even to this day, how difficult it is in certain venues, the most popular mass media venues. So basically, I tried in much of my work on American history to avoid specific theoretical concepts and terms, or for that matter, even calling myself a Marxist. Mm-hmm. But I still, it is all framed, all my work, whether I'd like it to be or not, it's all framed in that sensibility that Marx imbued, and Marx and Gramsci and others of that tradition. So I'm not running from it so much as it, in some ways, it sort of handicapped my efforts, or disabled, whatever the term, because of the fact it would just give away it would just immediately send up red flags, and I mean red flags in the classical sense.
It's a triggering term for people who know nothing about it. And I come from the same place where I identify when I'm talking to, people who aren't really on the left as a socialist, because I find that term is more palatable.
Yeah.
But my first question, actually, since we're talking about Marxism, is how would you define being a Marxist? If someone wanted to say, I don't particularly say Marxist because I don't feel like I have read enough of Marx to have earned that moniker. But from my understanding, it's, and you can maybe confirm or deny this, but it's, you subscribe to the concepts of historical materialism and the way in which Marx wrote about society and the contradictions of capitalism.
Yeah.
But I'll let you take it.
Right. I mean, I generally, there's another term I generally avoid: historical materialism. Okay. But I can tell you in one line of Marx what I think is a sort of fundamental sensibility and understanding that I bring to political and historical thinking and criticism and everything else. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Okay. Ancient slavery, I mean, in specifically Western or European terms, Western, slavery, feudalism, lord and peasant relations, capitalism, capitalist and worker. Those, I mean, I don't have to subordinate every idea I have to that concept. The world is more complex than that. But it is the case I cannot avoid quite often looking at and seeing things with the understanding that there is an ongoing class struggle. Unfortunately, for the past 50 years, that's taken the form of a class war from above. Ever since the 1970s, when not only in the United States, but in the United States, the corporate elite with their conservative and neoliberal allies declared war on working people. But not only on working people, but also by way of culture wars on the rights won by all of us for women and the rights won by all of us for people of color. But it is the case, I think you've heard me say it before, look, we've experienced 50 years of class war from above. When you look close, it's hard to see the war from the bottom up, in the sense that the mobilizations are more like retreats for these 50 years. But if you think about it from the top down, you can see the degree to which in every realm it's as if the corporate elite was going to take back the powers that it had lost in the course of the period from the 1930s to the 1960s. And as a consequence, we have inequalities in this country, material inequalities in this country, but in other ways that rival, if not are worse than the first Gilded Age of the late 19th century, the age of the robber barons. So to me, in fact, somebody asked me, another historian who I doubt if he'd ever use the term these days, Michael Kaye, but he asked me, God, it must be 20 years or so. What am I talking about? 30 years or so. He said, you still think of yourself as a Marxist? And I said, yeah, but I don't go around saying I am a Marxist. But all my work is still informed with that sensibility and those ideas.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense, that looking through the lens of history as the story of class struggle, I think that's a really clear, concrete way to define Marxism, or at least in a way define Marxism. And I hear what you're saying about, again, trying to not scare people off who maybe don't know a lot about this, about this world. I
mean, really, these things do matter. So, for example, again, I think we've had so many conversations about these kinds of things. I'm telling you what you've already heard me say, but for everyone else's sake, when Bernie Sanders became a candidate for president, and he was insistent upon the term democratic socialist, even that was a problematic term in American political life.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So I remember thinking to myself, well, Bernie, why didn't you say you're an FDR Democrat? Because everything he was calling for was in tune with FDR's conception of liberalism, or as FDR put it on occasion, militant liberalism, which is not the liberalism we think of today. It was really social democratic politics and ideas. But Bernie didn't do that. He made a point of giving speeches in the first campaign of 16 and the next campaign of 20 to try and explain himself. His explanation, though, further proved my point. What did he do? He went back to FDR and talked about FDR's Economic Bill of Rights. And I remember I was talking to Bill Moyers, who I became friendly with, and Bill said to me, if you have to explain what you are, you've lost already. Okay? Offer your politics, offer your ideas. If you start explaining, people are going to wonder, what are you afraid of in what you're telling us?
Sure. I hear you on that. My counter would be, though, is that I do think that the use of the term democratic socialism did in some way demystify the concept of socialism, especially to my generation and younger generations. So I think normalizing it and bringing it into like the public discourse, I think does a lot to, like I said, to normalize and demystify it and make it not as scary.
Yeah, that's true. But now my counter argument for that is that if that was truly the case, we wouldn't be where we are right now. That what Bernie might well have done is linked it in some ways to what our grandparents and parents' generations were about in the 30s, the 40s, and so on.
Sure.
And as a consequence, I'm not saying he shouldn't have ever used the term democratic socialism, but it was made out that he was going to give a speech to explain what democratic socialism was. And what he explained does not even necessarily require the term democratic socialism. It could have been I like the term social democracy. I am a socialist, but if I run around saying, I'm a socialist, again, it means I have to explain it. If I say social democracy, then they'll say, what is that? And I can say, well, it basically says that there are things that ought to be fundamentally rights in American life and elsewhere, okay? There should be no need to argue about healthcare. Should be no need to argue about decent housing. It's that kind of, so it's an entree. And of course, I would also then say, but it'd be pretty good to nationalize certain industries.
Wow, we're only one question.
And I'd start by saying, just imagine if were determined to turn social media, when Twitter was big especially, take it out of the hands of whatever, Jack was his name, the original guy, Jack somebody?
Jack Dorsey.
I thought it was Dorsey,
yeah.
And then Elon Musk. I mean, that's an element of the public sphere. That's part of civil society.
Yeah.
That ought to be like a public trust.
Absolutely.
Okay, we ought not to allow the conversation in America to be owned, if you know what I mean.
I completely agree, yeah.
So that would, if you explain it like that, like democracy depends upon it. Anyhow, but I get you. Don't get me wrong. I do get you, and I know you get me.
I know we get each other. Yeah. I just want to point out we're only one question in, and we've already done what I said we shouldn't do, which is get really into the weeds on stuff. But you know what? It's going to be one of those episodes. All right, we're moving on to
either that or it's an ongoing series. What can we do?
It can always be an ongoing series. All right, this next question comes from one of our listeners. Lisa asks, what are some foundational texts that any leftist should read?
Okay, and I'm going to take that as exactly what it says, leftist. Okay, with the idea that probably given what we're talking about with anti-capitalism and so on, that I'll give a special emphasis within that to the Marxist tradition as well. Mm-hmm. Okay? Now, I'm going to be very honest. The first writer whose work I'm going to refer to is my hero ever since I was 10 years old, which makes it, how old am I? That's 64 years since I discovered this figure. I think every leftist, at least in America, should read Thomas Paine's Common Sense.
Okay.
And quite likely, and this is a universal kind of work, The Rights of Man, and last but not least, Agrarian Justice. And I'll explain. If we think about modern history, which is a loose concept, I think I could make a case, and I've made it over and over again, that the most radical statement that essentially defined what modern history would be about was Thomas Paine's writing in Common Sense, this line: "We have it in our power to begin the world over again." To me, that's the foundation of progressive, radical, left radicalism.
Yeah.
Okay, for a start. Just as Marx's, the history of all hitherto existing societies, the history of class struggle, to me is fundamental in the sense of a struggle for social democracy, socialism, whatever we want to call it. Okay. Then in Rights of Man, Paine stands on his own shoulders from Common Sense. Rights of Man he wrote in the midst of the French Revolution, as a defense of both the American and the French revolutions against the father of modern conservatism, Edmund Burke, the Anglo-Irish parliamentarian and philosopher. And in that work, he really does lay out a defense of these revolutions, and also talks about how liberating they are, even to the point of liberating people's capacities and genius, that kind of thing. It enables people who are otherwise under the foot of aristocrats and kings and so on. And it actually became the bestseller ever, probably in European history, definitely in its age. So we go from the American Revolution to a more, if you like, almost universal revolution. And Rights of Man has inspired the left globally, Latin America and elsewhere. Then the third pamphlet of his, which is a curious one, is Agrarian Justice. And in this, he argues against the prevailing thought that poverty is not inevitable, and moreover, that poverty is a product. He doesn't use the word capitalism. This is early for him to have done that. But he used the word a product of civilization, of the development of what was soon to be the Industrial Revolution.
Of progress.
So, of progress, yeah.
Yeah.
But he said, but it need not be. And he laid out what would become the first model or plan for what we would today call Social Security. And that's in the 1790s.
Wow.
Oh, yeah. He is the godfather of Social Security. And what he talks about is, look, the major form of wealth in the age in which he lived was landed wealth. And he said, and he uses biblical imagery to get to this. He goes, look, if God created the heavens and the earth for all of us, the earth in particular, then it means that anyone who's monopolizing the land owes the rest of us rent. And that rent they should have to pay into a community, national, whatever kind of trust. And the trust will then make life easier for young people to never fall into poverty, and people of a mature age, a seniority age, to not have to work. And he calls this old age pensions and basically grants to young people to get a start. What today would be called baby bonds, but in his version, it's the idea that you would get it when you reach the age of maturity, whether it's 16, 18, or 21. So here he is, this truly radical thinker who was himself not educated. He's part of a self-educated class of artisans and craftsmen. His father was a stay maker, a corset maker. But here's Paine envisioning transformation of the inequalities and oppressions of the day into a much more democratic kind of order. And then he says, but he grants, that the market, which he thought would bring an end to battles among countries, the market itself generates inequalities and poverty that need to be addressed. And thus, you tax the rich and then provide these monies to others. So it's the beginnings of social democracy, to go back to what I was saying before. That's the first book I would say Americans should read, or the first three books that anyone should read, really, of the left. The second book undeniably has to be Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. I mean, like Thomas Paine's greatest work, Common Sense, is a pamphlet, but it was indeed a manifesto. And it was written in 1848 for workers, German and other workers who were exiled into Paris. And they asked Marx and Engels to write this statement of purpose. And Marx turned it into this incredibly, I think it's a work of high literature, Communist Manifesto. In fact, Frank, you and I and Rivka could probably spend a session just on that, and I'll point out how rich the work is. And it's not at all hard to read, as is Capital, say, as an example.
Oh, sure, yeah. Very readable, the manifesto.
Right, but this one really does lay out a kind of a small world history, from slavery to feudalism and then capitalism. The beauty of it is, and capitalists create their own gravediggers, because as they advance industry and as industry grows, so grows the working class. The force that can literally topple and overthrow capitalism in favor of socialism, which is fundamentally a far more universally democratic kind of social order. But I'm only touching, I've only talked about class struggle. There is in there these lines where he actually explains how it is that capitalism is so revolutionary that it actually couldn't care less about the relations of the family. It couldn't care, capitalists couldn't care less. It reduces everything to the cash nexus, to the wage relationship. It's so rich in its imagery. It's just fabulous. So definitely Marx's Communist Manifesto. I'm not going to say they have to read Capital. I don't believe people have to read Capital. I think it's an adventure. If you take it on, the way to do it is not alone. And of course, it's an adventure to read. And there are places where, again, it becomes like a great work of literature. I'll never, when he gets to the point where he starts to, where he's talking really about alienation and reification, where you start giving human qualities to commodities, okay? And in this age in which we live, in which advertising turns literally not just talking animals, but also talking toilet paper rolls. I mean, you've got everything going. It's both magnificent, capital at points, and also a slog. There's no other way to put it.
Yeah, I still have not finished Capital. I think I've read about the first half of Volume 1, plus other excerpts.
Yeah, you'd have to be a masochist to go on to volumes 2 and 3, and I did not. I own them, but I never went on to them. How's that?
I will suggest, actually, for our listeners, if you're interested in Capital, but it's intimidating, the writer Hottest Tier put out a book a few years ago called A People's History of Capitalism, where they do a really great summation of the key concepts in Capital. So that's a little bit, that's much more accessible.
I'm going to show Frank. The rest of you can't see it because we don't do YouTube any longer. This is a little book, right, Frank? It's a little book I'm talking about. By Ernst Fischer, who was a journalist, a politically active figure in post-war Austria. He started as a social democrat. He was a communist, I guess, after World War II. In Austria, he became active in politics for a while. And then he did art history, a sort of social history of art history. And this book, Marx in his own words, is a brilliant little work. I can't vouch that it's even in print any longer, but it's available used in a lot of used bookstores. And definitely if you go to Abe Books, I would imagine, they would have copies of this.
Oh, very cool.
It's called Marx in His Own Words. This is really just an excellent work. And then moving on from Marx, and by the way, the Communist Manifesto was Marx and Engels. I shouldn't slight Engels. I too often do, because Engels himself said really it was Marx's work. But it is the case that all of Marx's work depended on Engels, if only because Engels was the one who had the money to be able to underwrite Marx's writing.
Yes.
Okay, just so people understand. Oh, another thing I would do for people who want to just dabble in Marx, in the sense they don't want to read all of these big volumes of Capital and stuff. There's a volume of selected writings, Karl Marx Selected Writings, edited by David McClellan, no D at the end, David McClellan, who also wrote a great book, call it a sort of intellectual biography of Marx. David McClellan, McLellan.
And we'll make sure to link all of these titles in the episode description, or put them together in a document so everyone can have easy access.
The next book I'm going to refer to, I wasn't sure if I was going to because I'm not that fond of it, okay? But since Frank brought up Marxist-Leninists, I have to do so. Lenin, State, and Revolution.
Yes.
I mean, it is a classic of Marxist thought, but it's a classic actually of Marxist-Leninist thought. It is a real leap to go from Marx and the Manifesto to State and Revolution. I don't mean a leap in terms of difficulty of understanding, but Lenin had a completely different understanding of the capacities of workers to create socialism. Lenin had a different understanding than did Marx. Okay, Marx believed that intellectuals had a role, but they didn't bear the truth unto themselves. That is, that it was a dialectic, a back and forth. In other words, as he put it, I think, even the educator needs to be educated. Whereas Lenin believed you needed a vanguard, and the vanguard carried the truth. And he believed that workers at best could achieve trade unionism and labor unionism. Now, to be fair, Marx and Lenin operated in different historical moments and decidedly different societies. I mean, Marx is a Central European in one of the most advanced, or, relatively advanced regions of the world when it came to science, technology, thought, and so on. Well, sorry, that's rather chauvinistic for me to say thought, but basically in terms of world history terms.
Yeah.
I mean, he's in Paris, he's in London, he came out of Berlin, the university, so on. And the working class in Western Europe was really the largest force in mid and late 19th century European history. Whereas Lenin comes out of Russia. And Russia was an overwhelmingly still peasant society when he's trying to create a revolution. So you can imagine
still feudal society, right?
Yes, essentially, in many ways, a feudal-like society out in the countryside, landlords and peasants and so on. The only thing about that is that he refers to the working class as needing to be led by a vanguard. He's not talking, I think he wrote off the peasants as a potential progressive force too much anyhow. But to get back to the point, it's still a necessary work. If only because if you take the side that I would take of Marx versus Lenin, not Marxism, Leninism, it's important for you to understand what's involved in Lenin's thinking. Plus, Lenin and the Bolsheviks, or the Soviet revolutionaries, their influence upon the later development of socialism, especially the communist parties, is it's overwhelmingly powerful. I also would recommend a look at Trotsky's work, which folks who come out of the communist tradition often disavow because of when Stalin took power in the Soviet Union, his first enemy he was going to crush was Trotsky, and Trotsky went into exile and later actually was killed in Mexico City by Stalinist agents. So anyhow, but Trotsky is a fascinating guy. In fact, in some ways, it's a more interesting story than any of that period's revolutionaries. There was a writer, Isaac Deutscher, who was himself communist, who became part of the Fourth International, the Trotskyist International. Isaac Deutscher wrote a 3-volume biography of Trotsky.
Damn.
The Prophet Armed, The Prophet... anyhow, they're classic works, phenomenal history. And for what it's worth, I have a particular interest in Deutscher because I won the Deutscher Prize back in 1993, I guess it was, something like that, which was an award given every year to the best book in Marxist and sort of left writing, which, anyhow, so Deutscher, I looked into him, and he's got a fascinating story, which if I started, we wouldn't be able to do the rest of it.
Is there a specific text from Trotsky that you would recommend?
Oh, at this moment, there isn't. If I got into it, I'd get into it too deep. Just so you all know, I told Frank that I'm going to study up for this, and he said, don't study up for it, just think and be prepared. So anyhow, I didn't study up. And
so it's my fault. Yep.
Yeah. Yes, thank you for being
Yeah. I take responsibility.
Okay, now, the next figure I'm going to mention to me is this is the guy I just absolutely adore, Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist. He was a socialist. He had a severe disability. He had a hunchback, basically. But he was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. His family was originally rooted in Albania, but he was born in Sardinia. And he goes off to university in Turin. And he gets involved as a socialist writer and a journalist and doing his degree studies. And then when the Russian Revolution occurs, it's not fully defined yet, but he's clearly one of the founding figures of the Italian Communist Party. And what's important in the period 1918 to 1920 in Italy is the workers in the automobile factories in Turin occupy the factories. They are literally creating, working class revolution. And of course, that incites capitalists to come to support fascism and Mussolini basically in the course of the 20s takes power and crushes the opposition. And as he told the judge, let's shut down Gramsci's brain forever. And they sent him off to prison. Here's the thing, okay? Gramsci's contribution is this. Gramsci thought he was a Leninist. And while he was in prison, he wrote before he ever got to prison. He was a phenomenal writer. But in prison, he wrote what were called the prison notebooks. Now, to read that, you should probably... There are various books about Gramsci, and they'll give you some insight as to how, because he was writing these in prison, he had to cover what he was doing. He was very much influenced by Hegel and Croce, the great Italian philosopher, as well as Lenin and Marx. But what Gramsci does is he covers himself by using the language of Machiavelli. Oh. So he calls the party the prince. I mean, he does a lot of these things because he's in prison, and he gets supplied books and materials by the great Italian economist Piero Sraffa, who gets out of Italy, and he's on the faculty at Cambridge University with Keynes. And Sraffa sets up an account for Gramsci to be able to order books to the prison.
Oh, wow.
So in fact, they may have shut down Gramsci, the political activist, but they couldn't shut down the brain. And it's become known. I mean, Gramsci's prison letters are considered a classic work of Italian literature, and the notebooks have to be among the greatest of any left writer, I think, in the modern age. I mean, I really threw myself into it, and I studied Gramsci, and I thought it was just phenomenal. Now, what is it about Gramsci? Well, Gramsci really takes the idea that even the educator has to be educated, and he's really concerned about that relationship between intellectuals and the workers, and the role that the intellectual would play in cultivating. So he then talks about organic intellectuals who should because he himself is one of those, he's come out of the working class, and yet he's an intellectual within the working class. But similarly, you don't have to have emerged out of the working class to align yourself and basically operate within that milieu and work in favor and in support. I forgot the term for the other intellectual classes. Those are the ones who take jobs in advertising agencies, basically. Okay. Yeah, the short, that's my shorthand for that. So Gramsci is just remarkable. And another person who I've read some of her work, but not enough to go on at length about it, is Rosa Luxemburg, okay, who was a Polish Jew who ends up in Germany. She's a leading figure in the socialist and communist movements. She is eventually killed after World War I, basically by groups of folks on the left who just want to shut her down. And they're in the government. I won't go into the details. Rosa Luxemburg is brilliant.
Reform or Revolution, right? That's the big one?
Thank you. I should have the title. I should have said Social Reform or Revolution, Reform or Revolution. And she comes down on the side of revolution, but she's also a humanist, and so it's not simple-minded at all. Okay? The first one after her is something emerged after World War I in Germany, known as the Frankfurt School of Social Research. This included Adorno and Horkheimer and Herbert Marcuse, who eventually becomes a major figure in the 1960s as a sort of intellectual mentor to a whole generation of left politics and thought. And also another figure who is definitely a member of this Frankfurt School. School meant for a while they had an institute at Frankfurt, but Frankfurt Institute of Social Research, something like that. But it also implies generally a milieu, that a group of intellectuals who worked in relation to one another. Walter Benjamin, who is different than the others in some ways. They would call him eccentric, but he wrote incredible works about urban life and about the role of the working class. But I'll instead of going over all of that, let me just say that there was an essay he wrote, which is in a book in translation. The volume in which the essay appears is titled Illuminations. And I'm going to show you, Frank, just so you can see it for yourself. Okay, this is the paperback edition. Okay. In this, there's an essay, and I love his essays. He's just a great essayist. But this was actually a set of theses, not feces, theses, okay? Theses. And it's titled, the working title would be Theses on the Philosophy of History. And I think if you read that piece by piece at night and just think about it, but also perhaps read some biography of Benjamin, some of them are awful, but if you read about them, you'll understand what he's asking. All the Frankfurt School thinkers were asking, all of them were asking, why did the working class not stage the revolution they expected? In other words, why was it, for example, that workers went to war against each other in World War I? And what can explain that? So some of them are heavily influenced by Freud. They're trying to work out the psychology and social psychology of the masses, so to speak. What are we talking about here? And there are others who are doing this around Europe. In Walter Benjamin's case, in some ways, he sticks closer to the ideas of the dialectic, the dialectics. And if we had time, Frank, it would be worth choosing one to work on. But we don't have that time. But go look at Walter Benjamin. That's all I can say. The tragedy of Benjamin is that he leaves Germany to France because the Nazis have taken over. All of them go into exile. Some went to London and then go on to come to the United States and actually become associated with both Columbia University and also the New School for Social Research in New York. Marcuse ends up teaching at Brandeis, and then he goes out to University of California, I think San Diego, but I think it was that one. Walter Benjamin goes to Paris, and when the Germans conquer France, he heads towards the Spanish border, because even though Franco and the fascists have taken over there, they are not blatantly aligned with Hitler. And if you're in France, you can escape to Spain. Okay, you may be interned, but you're not going to be sent back, so to speak. Okay, so he makes his way into the Pyrenees, and he finds this guy who smuggles people into Spain. But something goes wrong along the way. And he reaches a level of despondency, apparently, that just he can't deal with, and he commits suicide in the Pyrenees. But his stuff is great. He had good friends who had actually escaped, Jewish intellectuals who had gone to Palestine. I mean, that milieu was just phenomenal. The Frankfurt School continues to operate as an intellectual force, but Walter Benjamin is dead at that point. Okay, but his stuff is just so much. I don't want to say fun to read, but when you get into it, it is kind of fun. At least it was for me.
Thought-provoking, engaging, yeah.
Having mentioned those books in that kind of tradition, let me say that I think it's essential to know when works are written and what significance they had. So you can, whenever you do that, look for some kind of history of the period or biography of the figures you're reading. As E.H. Carr, the British historian, once said, "Before you read the history, know the historian." That's how he put it. Okay?
Oh, I like that a lot.
But I want to mention a couple of Marxist historians who I knew and who were part of this group called the British Marxist Historians, who transformed, I think, in a very popular way as well as a scholarly way, our way of approaching the past. Influenced very directly by Marx, and they were for a good number of years, most of them until 1956, when they left the party because Soviet Union invaded Hungary. They were in what was called a Communist Party Historians Group, and their ambitions were really to rewrite British history from the bottom up, in other words, to make sure people appreciated the struggles of peasants in the past and of working class people in the degree to which it shapes history. So they were interested in the questions of class struggle. This is a world historical figure I'm going to mention, Eric Hobsbawm.
I've heard of Hobsbawm, but I've not gotten into
and
him.
The three volumes people should look into. The Age of Revolution, which is from, you can imagine, the French Revolution of 1789 to the Revolution in Europe of 1848. The Age of Revolution. I read that as an undergraduate at Rutgers, never knowing later I would write a book about him and his cohort and become friends with Eric right through to when he passed away.
Oh, wow.
So the next volume in that series is The Age of Capital, and that goes from 1848 to 75 maybe, okay, when industrial capitalism really comes to be the ruling force in Europe, okay? And then from the last volume, again, it was like 18... How wrong was it? 1880? It doesn't matter, okay? To 1918, thereabouts. In other words, it's the period called the Age of Empire. And it comes to a close basically around World War I, but it comes to a close in particular because communist historians did not feel like they should write on the 20th century for some time. And mostly because they did not want to get in trouble with the party. They could write about history of the 18th and 19th centuries, but they would not be subject to party discipline if they moved outside of the party's expectations. But if you wrote about the 20th century, that's the Communist Party suppressed intellectual thought. We have to understand that, okay? And so he didn't write. He said that was it. 3 volumes, that's it. But then, after the fall of the Soviet Union, he never left the party. The party disintegrated around him. And ultimately, he did write a 20th century history, which is considered, again, a classic work. And this moment, I just blanked on the title. I should have written it down. But it's, again, Hobsbawm was a master at history, a masterful historian.
The Age of Extremes?
Yes, The Age of Extremes, the 20th century history, right. And sometime, when you and I are together sometime, and if you're curious to know more about these intellectuals and stuff, I could tell you stories about Hobsbawm and my conversations with him, but this is not the place to do it, okay? And now, because I emphasize Gramsci, I want to mention another historian who I was very close to, and he and Eric Hobsbawm were like, I'm showing crossed fingers. They were that close, okay?
Demarcating closeness, yes. That's the visual, yep.
Right, not good luck, but right. George Rude, R-U-D-E, an accent on the E. The name comes from, his father was Norwegian. Rud was his name. And when he went to school, he was constantly picked on as Rude George. So when he became an adult, he thought, well, he'll put an accent on the E, which almost makes it sound French, George Rude. And by the way, his classic work, his most famous book, which is not the one I'm recommending, is The Crowd in the French Revolution. But he wrote a lot of books. And the one I want to call people's attention to, he wrote late in his life, in fact, titled Ideology and Popular Protest. And he takes Gramsci's ideas, basically, and shows how historically true and effective they were. In other words, well before Gramsci, that even peasants shaped the thinking of their age's intellectuals. I mean, it's goes from, I guess, medieval, even comes to, I think, the U.S. history, the American Revolution and beyond. I mean, it's just great. I'm the executor of his literary estate, and I brought out, after his death, I brought out a fresh edition where I enhanced the bibliography at the end, and I wrote an introduction. And it's published by University of North Carolina Press. Ideology and Popular Protest, or as the English say, Ideology and Popular Protest. Okay.
Thank you for the distinction, yes.
Yeah, and last but not least, a book that I've reviewed, and if you want to read, by the way, it's in the collection of my essays titled Take Hold of Our History. It's a book by Steve Frazier, who I was involved with in a political group called Scholars, Artists, and Writers for Social Justice, and our task was to put the labor question on behalf of labor unions onto the public agenda. Well, Steve, fascinating writer and historian, has written a history of Wall Street. He wrote the biography of Sidney Hillman, the great American labor leader during the age of the 20s through the 40s. But he wrote one book, this might go back, 10 years, half a dozen years ago. It's titled The Age of Acquiescence. And he's asking this question, why was it in the 19th century American workers were rambunctious and rebellious, okay, and challenged the political and economic order? And he said, what happened? Or as I titled my review essay, what the fuck happened? Okay? And my review of the book is, I love the first half of the book. It's great. It's as if Marx himself had written about 19th century United States. The latter half of the book I'm not so keen on because he gives a little too much credit to capitalists' ability to control the thinking of working people. Mm-hmm. It's almost Frankfurt School-like in that way, and he underestimates the degree to which workers have remained rebellious. Anyhow, it's a really, really good book to read, okay?
I am halfway through The Age of Acquiescence, and I've really enjoyed it so far, so maybe I'm about to stop enjoying it based on your review.
Well, maybe he won't. Maybe he won't, because keep in mind, what happens is he's not Gramscian enough for my taste in the latter half of the book. And he discounts even in a major event here in Wisconsin that I was involved in as well, and that was when we occupied the state peacefully and kept it clean, but we occupied the state capitol in 2011 because we were losing our collective. They were turning us into a state that did not allow for collective bargaining and unions by public employees. And I will point out, Wisconsin was the first state in the United States to actually grant public employees collective bargaining rights back in 1959. So this was a truly reactionary move and devastating in many ways. And we occupied the state capitol for a stretch of time. And he just refers to it in passing, underestimating its significance. Anyhow.
Well, before we go on to the next question, I'm just going to throw out a few titles that I have found very helpful as well. A few titles that I really recommend to people: Women, Race, and Class by Angela Davis, Capitalist Realism by Mark Fisher. If you want to get, again, into the weeds on stuff, A People's History of the United States is, of course, a huge, sprawling, very important text.
And I want to go on record as saying I dissent from that recommendation.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Give me quickly, why do you dissent?
Well, I've been fascinated by the fact that, for a start, young people, when they read it, feel like all of a sudden, the truth has been revealed to them. Mm-hmm. Okay? Mm-hmm. But actually, I would like people to reflect on this fact. If you read that, and you know something about American history, that should be one of the most depressing books you've ever read, as opposed to inspiring. Because every single movement that he refers to loses. And that's not the story of those movements at all.
Okay.
Number one.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, I think he misrepresents and turns both Lincoln and FDR into one-dimensional figures. And I think he's made a terrible mistake. He does not appreciate in some ways, I don't think he appreciates the concept of dialectic, but it doesn't matter in this case. I don't think he appreciates how history is made, okay, and the degree to which there are contradictions and advances, and the degree to which the likes of Lincoln and FDR led revolutions effectively, which we can get into some of the time.
Wow. Shots fired.
He was a brave intellectual, but I think he allowed his I think he allowed some of his own experiences to literally end up, or he was so eager to debunk that he ends up making an ineffective argument about what he really would like to do.
All right. I think that's a totally fair criticism. Last two titles I recommend to people are Manufacturing Consent by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky. It's, the most important text about media literacy out there. And there
I do agree. I want to second your recommendation, but I do want to warn people. That it ultimately becomes almost too one-dimensional in the degree to which it's so effective, because I could debunk that book's arguments.
Okay. All right. And then lastly, this is a personal favorite, a book called Evil Geniuses, The Unmaking of America by Kurt Anderson. This is...
I've heard of it, but I don't know it.
I describe this as the story of the 50-year-long class war from above that you alluded to earlier. Written for your dad to read. Your maybe like non-radical dad, but your dad who understands that, like, all those politicians are bought and paid for. If your dad is someone who's like, everyone's crooked, but you don't know why, it's a great history of kind of like like you said, the class war going back from the Powell memo through I think he covers the Trilateral Commission.
Oh, yeah, sure. I've written about those things.
Reaganism, and then and then how all of that shit got implemented. So that's a good one, I think, for your dad to get.
That sounds like a great one.
Yeah. All right. Moving on to our actual third question. I know I promised you that we weren't going to get too in the weeds on. Like, I know. Well, listen up. We'll relax on hard conceptual stuff.
You're going to ask me to explain the dialectic.
Well, because we got a last-minute question, literally came in right under the wire, like 10 minutes before we started recording. Lana asks, what is the most obvious example of dialectical materialism that you can think of from real life? I still struggle to understand it, and maybe a real-life example would help me. And I think for this, the simpler we can keep it, I think the easier it is to understand.
Okay. First of all, I'm going to do it in a sort of, let me point out that the dialectic is itself as a concept is rooted in Hegelian thought. Mm-hmm. Okay. And the idea that Hegel was propagating was that ideas, and we'll stick to the Hegelian understanding, so we're talking ideas, okay? Not materialism necessarily, but ideas for a start. I always told my students that you're taught when you're growing up not to argue because arguing was bad.
Yep.
Okay, but actually, arguing is creative, and I made a point of talking about the Jewish intellectual tradition way back, the tradition of arguing. And there's a saying in Jewish culture that says, 2 Jews, 3 positions. Mm-hmm. Now, what did that get at? That got at this. So somebody lays out an argument about something or a proposition. That proposition, if it's a proposition, has a contradiction, has a counter-argument. Mm-hmm. Okay? A thesis
and an antithesis, right?
An antithesis. So a thesis is rendered. By its very being, that thesis brings into being its own antithesis, its contradiction. Mm-hmm. Now, it is possible that the confrontation of ideas will go nowhere. But it's also quite possible that out of that confrontation of ideas, that argument, a new idea may well emerge, which will be better or more advanced or will take us further in understanding the world or whatever it is we're arguing about. The way they often put it is thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
Synthesis, yeah.
Okay, and now, synthesis implies elements from thesis and antithesis. It's not always that. Sometimes literally a whole new thing may emerge. If I can use sex as the example, at least not sex, but reproduction. Mm-hmm. Okay, you've got a man and a woman, and they come together, and they create a baby. That in itself is kind of dialectical, if you ask me. Okay.
Yeah, the way that I learned dialectics in the Hegelian tradition was, thesis is blue is the best color, the antithesis is red is the best color, and the synthesis is best color is subjective. Everyone can have their own favorite color.
Oh, I thought you were going to say purple.
That would have been a way to go with it, yeah. But does that fit into what we're talking about?
But let me. So my point is this, okay? In historical terms, as I said earlier regarding the Communist Manifesto, the development of capitalism, which becomes, a social order dominated by capitalists, it's not market relations capitalism. It's a particular relationship of production. Or speaking in a more Marxist terms, it's a relationship of exploitation. So landlord peasants of the Middle Ages, as capitalism develops, it literally supersedes feudalism. But the more important thing is that capitalists only become capitalists when they create an operation, an enterprise that employs workers. And what they're doing is they are employing workers for their labor. And for capitalists to survive in that market economy, they have to make sure that they make a profit. They have whatever the value that is produced by workers, okay, the capitalist expropriates or appropriates that from the workers. Better yet, workers do not decide what happens to what they produce. The capitalists do. And in the course of capitalists selling the product of workers' labor, okay, is where capitalism is a process of exploitation. Mm-hmm. Now, it's also the case that there always has to be surplus, even if you lived in socialism. You've got to produce more than you consume. That's a fundamental. Otherwise, you can't have babies or you can't take care of people who themselves can't work. But this is the point. As capitalism develops, the numbers of workers expand. Peasants are displaced from the countryside. They come into the cities. They're employed not simply in workshops, but in factories. The dialectic is this. When workers enter into factories, it doesn't take long it's automatically a situation of exploitation. That exploitation inevitably gives rise to conflict. Mm-hmm. And in fact, so the dialectic is that capitalism, as it emerges, brings into being its, as Marx said, its own grave diggers, mm-hmm. the workers, whose development in the course of the class struggle may well involve organizing. And eventually his argument is that workers across the country will organize, come to see their shared interests, and understand that for them to be able to truly thrive, to not feel like, to not just feel, but not to experience exploitation, they've got to overthrow capitalism or undo it by some process in favor of socialism. And I just want to make this one statement, and we can always talk about it another time. People say, well, what really is socialism? Well, you can define it dictionary-like way. It's, collective ownership of the means of production, or the state ownership, or public ownership. But ultimately, it's when the struggle for democracy is so effective that the economy itself is subject to democratic control by working people. Okay. So I don't know if that will suffice as an explanation of the dialectic, but there you go.
It was very comprehensive. I always understood dialectical materialism to be, like the change in either a person or an enterprise's material conditions that then thus create either a new set of conditions or a new conflict, like you're saying.
Yeah, I think about it in grander historical terms and not just ongoing.
Got it. Well, wouldn't that be historical materialism? Would be the under?
Well, it would be, but so people understand the term materialism was developed as a counter to Hegel's idealism, because Hegel talked in terms of the spirit of an age, the governing spirit of an age, and Marx basically takes Hegel, as some people often say, and stood him upright. Hegel was lost in this idealism, and Marx loved Hegel, his ideas, but he became part of the young Hegelians, all of whom ultimately were determined to transcend Hegel's thinking in their own dialectical way. And Marx is one of the folks who wants to turn it from idealism to materialism, which does not mean economy only. Mm-hmm. That's important. People often say, well, isn't Marx isn't he just pushing technological or economic determinism? Absolutely not. It's social relations of production at the heart of the materialist question, which necessarily includes law, because law is, without Without law, capitalism couldn't exist. Capitalism, because there are laws about how the enterprise will operate, about how workers will be exploited or not exploited, and so on. Sorry, I'm getting into my long-standing lecture mode.
No, you're good. I just want to make sure we get to the core of Lana's question. Let's take the French Revolution as an example.
The thesis is that landlord-peasant relations are inevitable. The world in which peasants lived and landlords ruled them and exploited them was inevitable. That's a landlord-peasant order. The thesis is feudalism. Okay. But the peasants know they're being exploited. They're not stupid. People know, by the way, people know when they're being exploited.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the assumption, which, by the way, is why I don't buy the Leninist arguments quite often. Okay. People know. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Mm-hmm. Right? Lenin says, well, you need the party to enable that, and you need the vanguard of the party. But Marx said, workers themselves will come to understand what's happening, and they will come to see, by the way, one of the ways in which workers come to see the possibilities is they see each other and the solidarity that emerges. And that very idea of solidarity in the workplace could well be the basis of socialism, and it must be the basis for socialism and communism. So the thesis is that this mode of production is inevitable. The antithesis is that capitalists and workers literally are in conflict. The conflict, in essence, you've got capitalism being confronted now by class-conscious workers who are perhaps socialist inclined. The antithesis, the confrontation, the struggle. It may only advance to the extent that workers get better pay, get better hours, or it may well be that they win the right to vote.
Sure.
Not in the workplace, but literally across the country, if you get my drift.
Yeah.
Okay, so
I hear what you're saying. So thesis is the capitalism,
the order as it is.
Capitalism, right. Social relations. The antithesis.
Within capitalism, yes, is grows out of. It doesn't stand outside of it. It grows out of the very thesis itself. It ends. The contradiction exists. It emerges.
Mm-hmm. The antithesis being, like you said, class-conscious workers, intellectuals. Yeah. The synthesis is class struggle.
Yeah.
Does that work?
See, at Hegel's thing, it's idea versus idea. For Marx, it's class versus class.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember when someone explained sort of like the difference to me, and like you're talking about Hegelian idealism and Marx's materialism, and you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, but someone said, when we're taught history, at least in American public schools for the most part, we're sort of taught the history of leaders and ideas.
Yeah, that's standard everywhere, by the way.
Okay.
Around the world.
All right, but that's...
Or it had been that way. It's not quite that bad these days, except that the tests always resort to who was the king at this time or who was the president at that time.
Exactly. So we learn history in the way of like, what did the leaders do and what were the prevalent ideas of the time? Whereas Marx came in and said, no, this is actually about class struggle. This is about the people at the bottom and how they enact change over history.
Right. And some people call it history from below, and some people, as I do, history from the bottom up.
Mm-hmm. Great. Oof, finally got it. Okay, and you know what? Actually, that helped me because apparently I was getting dialectical materialism wrong.
Yeah, I don't want to be doctrinaire about it. But
No, you are quite literally a professor, so this is why we dig in and make sure we got everything clear. All right, so those were sort of like the entree questions. Now I want to get into a section, and I think letting our listeners know this is going to be a two-part episode. Didn't originally think it was going to be a two-part episode, but as always, Harvey is giving us all of the deep dive info.
Which is why I never, ever did everything in a course that I promised I would do.
Yeah, your syllabus was like 20 pages, and by the end of the semester, students were like, we only got through like 5 pages of the syllabus.
Something like that.
Is he going to test us on the rest of this shit? He didn't even teach us this shit.
Never tested on what I didn't do.
Okay, well, thank goodness. That's good of you.
And by the way, tell all the listeners being tested in the third episode of this question.
Yes, the third episode. Yeah, the third episode will be the test, exactly. Now I want to get into a section that I am calling debunking. So, something I'm really interested in, especially as I have engaged in my radicalism journey over the last several years, is encountering all of these kind of pre-programmed lines that people are given, especially in the United States after the Red Scare. These lines that sort of we hear from the defenders of capitalism, the sort of the gotcha lines. And, you've been at this longer than I have, so I bet that you have very good, succinct answers to a lot of these. And this was actually kind of sparked by during our Capitalism, a Love Story episode, which listeners should go and listen to. That was one of our favorites that we've ever done. We were talking about this part in the film where Michael Moore was playing, sort of like this capitalist propaganda from the 1950s and in black and white. And someone said, well, capitalism has led to the greatest increase in quality of human life and living standards in all of human history. And I think I said something to the effect of, well, that's a stupid argument because, the quality of life has increased over all of human history. So really, you're just describing time passing. And then you came in, the apt professor that you are, and you were like, wrong again, Frank, wrong again.
I want people to know that I include Rivka when I say this, and she's not here right now. I adore you two, you know what? When I was a professor, well, I am still a professor, but when I was the first year I was a full-time faculty member, my wife, I think she sat in a class with me. And after the class, she said, when you ask a question and the student answers you and they're wrong, you shouldn't tell them they're wrong. You should say, yeah, that's close, but let me explain more carefully. I said, but what if they are wrong? She goes, no. You don't want to alienate the student, to use a mark. Right. So anyhow.
You might not have actually said wrong. You might have said close. But the answer you ended up giving was, no, well, actually, it's the organized class struggle and labor struggles of the early 20th century that have won these concessions, that have won...
And right through the 1950s themselves.
And through the that have won a higher quality of life and standard of living. So... That was something where I was like, oh, that's the perfect way to reframe it, and that's the best answer to that.
Just give a contemporary example. If you think about the past 50 years, productivity has gone up tremendously.
Skyrocketed.
And ask yourself, where has all the money gone? Where's all the wealth gone? Mm-hmm. We've created billionaires who may soon be trillionaires for all we know, okay? While at the same time, we've impoverished, not we, sorry, as if you and I did this, but we've witnessed the impoverishment of the working class, which is a classic Marxist argument and didn't have to happen and would not have happened had it not been the case that those capitalists and conservatives and neoliberals hadn't launched this class war back in the 70s. And when they did, they were smart. They literally set out to crush labor unions. They made it a point of spending vast sums of money arguing in advertising and in pamphleteering and in building schools of business on an ever grander scale to propagate the idea that basically capitalism was so bountiful that everyone could appreciate these things, but at the same time made sure that the professors who were outside of the business school got paid pennies. I mean, it's just remarkable. They set out to silence the media if they could, silence professors if they could, and break up labor unions. That was the task. They laid it out publicly in those things you and I were talking about before, the Trilateral Commission report and the Lewis Powell memorandum. Mm-hmm. 2 weeks after Powell issued that memorandum detailing what they needed to do, he was appointed to the Supreme Court.
I know.
Yeah, so sorry. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. And I speaking of the Powell memo, I recommend any of our listeners just read the Powell memo. It's like, I don't know, what, 10, 20 pages, something
go
or other.
Online, just type in Powell memorandum.
And you'll read it and you'll see his 4-point plan and you'll think, oh shit, that's what happened. Got it. All right, but back to these sort of debunking questions. So
yes,
starting right at the top. It's the one we have all heard. Human nature is just to be greedy. Humans have fought with each other over resources, have warred with each other over resources, and pretty much everything we do, either collectively as a society or individually, is motivated by greed, by self-interest, because we're all individuals, and like, what are we supposed to do? Think about other people? So what do you say that capitalism is the political and economic representation, or I guess analog of human nature, which is to be greedy?
Well, the human nature question is one of the toughest of all the questions, because if people believe that's true, it's not simply that they've been taught it, it's that they've experienced it. And it really is hard to debunk.
That's a good point, yeah.
So in some ways, rather than come back with the argument, you've been subject to ideological, ideological control and all that, you say to them, so, wait a minute. You have friends? You have friends?
Yeah, I have friends.
And they say, well, yeah, exactly. You have friends. Well, do you literally become friends with someone to take advantage of them? Mm-hmm. Okay? No. You say, you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend. Okay? Is that relationship strictly so you can take advantage of them, exploit them? I mean, ask them, and unless they're real shitheads, they're not going to say, oh yeah, no, I don't do that, right? So you say, well, what you're doing is you're admitting that human nature doesn't reduce simply to that. Okay.
Human nature is multifaceted.
Okay. You might ask them, do you go to church? Do you belong to a union? I mean, you ask them various questions about how do they socialize? Do they, in the old days, I would have said to people, do you go bowling with other people? I mean, you do things to enjoy yourself. Okay. Admittedly, the element of self, you're not going to go out unless you're a sadomasochist. You're not going to go out and hope to get beaten up. You're not going to hope, that kind of thing. So, okay, we know from history, and you can lay out a series of moments in which people came together collectively, not simply to advantage themselves, but to make the community better. As simple as that, okay? And in essence, we have to understand that human nature is complex. Not to mention the fact there are two kinds of human nature. There is, and we don't fully even understand just how much of human nature it truly is instinctive, okay? The fact is we also have what we could call second nature, which the culture affords us. And if we live in a culture in which the rich are celebrated, okay, and working people are shunted to the side in the story, okay, or are portrayed as sort of, second class by nature, by themselves by nature. I mean, that's going to impress itself upon you to the point where you say, well, I guess the only way to get ahead is to try to take advantage of people. But that doesn't mean that was instinctively the most fundamental thing in your being, okay? I'll give you an example from my teaching. I was in a department, Democracy and Justice. And one year, this goes back quite some time, 30 years or so ago, I had a student, was teaching a course called Power and Change in America. And I teach in my other classes generally history from the bottom up and that kind of thing. But in this course, I made it a point of saying, okay, let's come to grips with what power is about. And so we did a lot of readings on corporate elites. And we looked at Chomsky and Herman's arguments about, what's it called again?
Manufacturing consent.
Referred to manufacturing consent. And I talked about that, but I also tried to explain the Gramscian understanding of resistance and so on. And I tried to explain to them, look, resistance, rebellion, and revolution, don't forget those terms. But I generally did that in other classes. So anyhow, at the end of the semester, I was so effective in teaching power that this young woman who I liked very much, and I thought she would going to major in our program, she wrote at the bottom of her test, which, by the way, got an A, but her remark was, you've persuaded me. They're winning. They're going to win. I'm changing my major to business. You can't beat them, you join them. And I said, oh, fuck. I said, okay. I overemphasized the power in Power and Change. So I said to my colleagues, you guys have got to start teaching the kind of stuff that we all should be teaching, and that is we have to teach in a more dialectical kind of history and politics and society. We've got to explain to people the degree to which the governing classes never forget the dangers presented by the classes that they rule over, and we have to come to grips with how can we teach not just obvious struggle but also modes of resistance. So I would tell my students a story. When I first came to UW Green Bay, without my being asked, I was told, you're going to teach one course at the state prison outside of town. It's a maximum security prison. Okay, so that tells you the kinds of inmates that there. Actually, it's everything from drug dealers to murderers and whatever. The way it worked is once you got into the classroom, which meant you went through a whole series of security checks, you had about 45 minutes to teach. Then there was a 15-minute break, and then 45 minutes. During the 15-minute break, everyone who, not me, but all the inmates had to go back to their cells. This was they were in an AA program, Associate of Arts degree kind of thing. Okay, it meant they already had a high school diploma. And some of them would never be out of prison, at least not for 20 years or so. So what I watched, and there were there was always a guard in each of the corridors. What I watched was very interesting. Not all of them went back to their cells. Some hung out. They didn't go. And I know that the guards were not supposed to allow that. So one day I said to one of the guards, I said, aren't you supposed to make sure they go back? He said, yeah, but it's kind of tiresome to constantly. So in essence, what happened was these inmates had worn down the power and they wore it down to the point where they at least were stretching their space allowed. Now, I'm not telling you that it was good or bad. I'm just telling you similarly, when you look even closely at slavery and the plantations, it wasn't, as brutal as it all was, slaves learned how to handle people to the point where some of them were able to expand upon their own, for lack of a better way of putting it, freedoms within that slavery. They weren't supposed to learn how to read. They weren't supposed to even be Christianized because that would have recognized they had souls, you might say. But they harnessed, because they did have access to preachers and others at various times, they harnessed the spirituals, they created the spirituals out of biblical stories as an assertion of their humanity, and also literally prepared for themselves a remarkable culture in this country. Mm-hmm. Their contribution to American culture grows out of their resistance to slavery, their resistance later to Jim Crow and all of that. And, it's like that. So we should never fail to appreciate what power entails and what authority demands, but we should also realize the capacities to resist. But the resistance beyond the individual often requires some kind of solidarity, trust in other people. So I guess human nature isn't just all greedy, or we'd all be out to screw each other. And I don't mean in the sexual fashion. I mean,
Yeah, I sort of answered similarly. I say something along the lines of, like, no one has nailed down exactly all of the aspects of human nature and what it entails. In fact, there are many conflicting schools of thought as to what pure quote unquote human nature is. And obviously greed and tribalism is an aspect of it, but so is community and solidarity, and collectivism is another aspect of it. And so when it comes to capitalism, I say that capitalism incentivizes and creates imperatives for the worst aspects of human nature, which are, like we're saying, greed, constant competition for competition's sake, wanting to get one over on your competitor or your neighbor, all of that stuff. So that's usually what I go with.
Right. There is no progress without even if we still buy into capitalism, there is no progress even within capitalism unless there's cooperation. Whether it takes the form of labor unions, whether it takes the form of community organization, whatever it is. And people cannot deny that those things exist, and that if they didn't exist, life would be shit.
100% agree. Harvey, I think we're gonna have to call it there for today. I'm really excited to get to these next ones. So there's a little teaser for the part 2 when we put it out. But really quickly before I let you go, because I know you've been working on this for a while, and I want to give you a chance to talk about it and plug it. Your comic with friend of the show Matt Strackbine, aka The Letter Hack, was recently published in Common Dreams. This is your illustrated version of a call for a 21st century economic bill of rights. I know we've talked about it on the show before, so we don't need to go into too much detail. Right. We'll put the link in. People should just go and read the comic and see the work. It's a really beautiful,
and it's full color.
Full color. It's not just line work. This is a full color multi-panel comic. Harvey is depicted in this comic, so you can actually look at Harvey while you're reading it. But I'm curious, how's the response been? And
actually, I can tell you, phenomenal. It's not like we're going to change the world as a consequence, and at least not this month. So it came out, and the response has been great. So, for example, I've gotten notes and letters from people. I spoke at a convention or conference before the Democratic Party convention that's now underway, called Progressive Central. And Alan Minsky, my colleague, with whom I wrote this Economic Bill of Rights, he was the man, really, by way of Progressive Democrats of America, who organized it. And he wanted me to speak early in the conference because he wanted to frame the entire gathering of hundreds and hundreds of people around that idea. This gathering included quite a few members of the Progressive Caucus, the Squad, in fact. Ro Khanna, Jayapal was there. She didn't get to Congress. Nina Turner spoke. Sarah Nelson spoke. Bernie Sanders spoke at the very end. It was a crew of celebrity progressives as well as, second-level celebrities like myself. And so I spoke. Ro Khanna and I shared the session, you might say. And the response to the whole idea was phenomenal. I did get a standing ovation for what it's worth. But I asked them, and it was great. On the screen above my head, was projected one of the pieces of the cartoon.
Oh, amazing.
Matt and I are talking, you'll remember the scene. It's like very early on in the comic strip. I say, "Why the fuck don't we have these rights already?" But the "fuck" was written out in the letter.
Yeah, in comic,
symbols,
asterisk, exclamation, yeah.
And it was right up there above, and I'm hoping the people go home with that image. So yeah, the response has been really good. In fact, we've done a few podcasts with other folks, and we did the Majority Report, and Sam Cedar, who just loves it, he said, "Is this going to come out in a comic book?" And the same question was asked in every one of the shows we did. Plus, those who were parents of teenagers said, "I need this in a comic book. This is the only way my kids will learn the history they're supposed to learn.
Yeah.
The history which isn't the history of just the elites." Okay, because we tell the story of where the Economic Bill of Rights originated 80 years ago by way of a speech that FDR gave, that he was inspired to give because Americans told him in polling that they wanted an Economic Bill of Rights. And then we carry it all the way through to the present, and at the end we actually show how we might organize to win an Economic Bill of Rights. If labor is resurgent, labor should embrace this idea. And I do want everyone to know that Frank was very gracious when he worked for the Lever News. He interviewed Alan and myself and did one of the best jobs interviewing us of that whole year, I think.
Oh, thank you. That's really kind of you. I mean, I love speaking with you about this. It was great to get to meet Alan, and I think it's such a common sense piece of policy and political framework that I think anyone, conservative, liberal, left, right, could read it and easily think, yeah, no, we should have all of those things for sure.
We actually found Data for Progress, this progressive polling service, ran a survey for us and revealed that 69% of people, it's not even being talked about in the major media at all, but 69% of Americans, that's 69% including Republicans, thought we ought to have an Economic Bill of Rights.
Nice. Very nice.
Yeah.
Well, we'll make sure to link to the comic Uncommon Dreams in the episode description in your podcast player. We'll also have a list of all of the books that Harvey mentioned and any other sources or references that we talked about in this episode. Harvey, it's always such a pleasure. And I'm so glad I get to see you next week for dinner. So this is a nice...
Right. A week from right now, actually, we should be meeting up.
That's right. A week from right now.
Let's talk about that, though. Okay. Not now, but
yeah, no, not on mic. No, we don't want to give away our location. Harvey, it's always a pleasure, and we'll see you again soon for part 2.
Yes, and maybe for part 2, Rivka will be home.
Yes, we'll make sure to we'll make sure that Rivka is present for this one for the part 2.
Otherwise, they'll think we're 2 male chauvinists.
That's true. And just to be clear, Rivka's not here because she's traveling and gave us her blessing to do this episode without her, but we'll make sure that she's on for the next one. All right, Harvey, okay. I'll talk to you soon.
You bet.
Thank you all so much for listening. Make sure to follow us on Instagram and TikTok. And if you want to support this show and get access to our bonus episodes, the link to our Patreon account is in the episode description in your podcast player, or you can find it at mvcpod.com.
For next week, we'll be watching Richard Linklater's 1991 debut feature, Slacker.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.